Hey everybody, Matt Colville here. This is the Sandboxing video. This is a video a lot of people have asked me for. A lot of people have asked me how I do it and what techniques I use. And there's a lot of videos I'd like to make. I want to make a video on 4th edition because after the interview with my friend Jim, which was really popular, a lot of people said, wow, you both really seem to like 4th edition. We want to hear about that. And I want to continue the politics series. And a lot of people have asked me how I award experience. And I want to start covering different adventures. And I promised you we'd go over a couple different campaign settings. But not all of those videos are equally useful for a new DM. And so I want to make sure that while we're doing the kind of stuff that I like to do, and whatever subject kind of strikes my fancy, including, movie stuff, I also want to make sure that new DMs are getting good content. And I think this is that kind of video. All right, what is a sandbox? When people talk about sandboxing in D&D, what do they mean? And I think what they mean is what in video games we would call an open world game. I used to work at a company called Pandemic Studios. I worked on Mercenaries 1 and Mercenaries 2. I was a designer and I was a writer. And Mercenaries was like GTA. It was GTA in a war zone was the phrase we used. It was both an open world game and a sandbox game. And using those definitions, which we'll talk about in a second, I don't really think D&D, I think it being a sandbox game kind of goes without saying. Sandboxing in video games means the designers tell you what to do, but they don't tell you how to do it, right? There's no right answer. And in fact, as a writer, I used to have to go to some of the other designers and say, no, you can't tell the player not to use this airstrike until they get to the mission that you gave them the airstrike for. Those are their airstrikes. They can use them for whatever they want. And they should be allowed to get themselves into a situation where they've taken this quest to blow up this building, but they used the airstrikes you gave them to do it. Now they have to come up with another way to solve that problem. And that was a big part of the fun of Mercenaries. Players would do things that we, the designers, never thought of. And that was delightful to us. We loved watching, like the first time I think anyone in a video game ever took a chunk of C4 and put it on a Jeep and then got in the Jeep and drove it, ejected from the Jeep and used the Jeep as a rolling bomb, detonating the C4 once the Jeep was where they wanted, was in Mercenaries. And we, the designers, had never thought of that. That wasn't something that that was something the QA guys discovered. It's one of my favorite things in Dungeons and Dragons is awarding magic items, specifically like random magic items. I roll on random magic item tables and the players end up with these suboptimal items, stuff that wasn't tailored and chosen specifically for them as their character. It's random stuff that they don't exactly know what to do with. And they sit around going, well, who can use this? Who wants to use this? We don't know. And then later when the chips are down and they're desperate, they come up with, this is the sandbox part, they come up with interesting and novel ways to use these items to save their bacon that I never thought of, and certainly the designers never thought of. Like, for instance, the first time, those of you who followed my campaign diaries may remember that it became a problem that the players were using the portable hole that they got to bypass a ton of content. But the first time they ever used it that way was when I had, and I was pretty proud of this, I had taken the party and I basically chopped them in two. A portcullis had fallen and divided the party into two chunks, and gnolls attacked from both sides. So when before it used to be the frontline fighters would fight the gnolls and the guys in the back, the magic user, the thief the ranger was able to stay at range. Now there were gnolls on both sides and they couldn't move where they wanted to move because the portcullis cut them off. And that's when Anna had the idea of using the portable hole in its cloth form, putting it through the portcullis, sticking it up on the wall. The players on the other side of the portcullis jump in the portable hole, and then Anna reaches through the portcullis and grabs the portable hole off the wall. And now they're all on the same side of the portcullis. In a video game, that would be a sandbox thing. That would be the kind of thing where the designers had never planned on that. They had never thought of the players doing that. And I was delighted when Anna did that. I thought that was fantastic. So later on, the portable hole got a reputation for being kind of a broken magic item, at least in my game, because of the way I was letting the players use it. But the first time they used it, it was amazing. And I thought, wow, that is super cool. I love that stuff. I love it when the players start using these items in novel ways that I guarantee you the designers of the game had never intended. In a video game, that would be a sandbox situation. The dungeon master set up the challenge, designed the encounter, and had no idea how the players would solve it. I do that all the time. People who watch my campaign diaries are often wondering, how did Matt know that the players would come up with a way to get out of this? And I'm like, I have no idea how they're going to get out of it. I'm constantly setting up challenges that on paper look ridiculous. The last time we played, which was actually several weeks ago, those of you who have missed the campaign diaries take heart in the fact that we haven't played since, for about 6 weeks now. But the last time we played, I threw a mind witness and a bunch bunch of drow at the players, and they were stuck in darkness and they were getting zapped by Mind Witness tentacles, and I had no idea how they were going to survive that, and it looked for a little while as though they were doomed. But then my friend Lars pulled a rabbit out of his hat and used sunlight. It dispelled all the darkness, and then Graves cast fear on the Mind Witness, and suddenly the tide of battle turned. So I do that all the time. I run the kind of game that challenges the players, and I don't really worry about how are they going to get themselves out of this. That's their job. I think most people who play D&D, though, when they talk about sandboxing, they mean what we who are video game designers consider an open world game. An open world game, in a video game at least, like Mercenaries, like GTA, it's up to you to decide what you want to do. It's up to you to decide what quests to go on, what missions to take. There isn't a main storyline. There isn't a wrong answer to the question, what should I do next? And in fact, the more you explore the world, the more interesting content you find. Contrast that with games like Last of Us, for instance, which have one storyline and there's no branching and you're just basically going to follow along with the story. And there are other games that blend that, and there are quest lines you can follow. There is a main, like Skyrim has a main quest line, but you can spend literally hundreds of hours lost in the nooks and crannies of that world. But even in Skyrim, there is a main quest line. It's just up to you whether or not to ignore it or follow it. With a game like Mercenaries, there is literally no main quest line. It's up to you to decide, who do I want to work for? And the choices you make, you can follow all the way through to the end of the game. So I think all of us who run D&D, we are running a kind of sandbox game because we create these encounters and we don't really have any idea how the players are going to solve these problems. Like, for instance, the Delian Tomb that I put up, one of my first videos was this little dungeon, and people constantly come to my subreddit and they tell me their experiences running that tomb, and players come up with lots of novel and interesting ways to deal with the things in that tomb that I never accounted for. And that is just the nature of D&D. The nature of D&D is sandbox play. So when we talk about sandboxing in D&D, we're talking about what would in video games be an open world game where you are free, the players are free to go wherever they want and do whatever they want within reason, obviously. I mean, GTA is an open world, but you can't play GTA San Andreas and leave San Andreas and go to Vice City, for instance. A lot of people have heard me describe the sandbox game that I run, and they want that feeling of the players being free to pick their own quests and follow their own storylines, and like, how do I do that? And I'm afraid, unfortunately, I don't have an answer that is easy. The only way I know how to do that is to do a lot of prep work. I can kind of get away with it because I've been running D&D for like 30 years, and I have run probably a dozen or 24 low-level adventures. And I liked some of them and I didn't like some of them. And so what I've done when I put together my sandbox campaign was I picked those low-level adventures that I thought were cool and engaging and fun to run. So I take all these adventures that I have run in the past and I just drop them all into my campaign setting, and we're going to talk about them right now. One of my favorite starting adventures is Against the Cult of the Reptile God. Here, let me move over a little bit. Yeah, there we go. Against the Cult of the Reptile God, which is, I think maybe, I mean, it's an old adventure, so it is burdened with a lot of the assumptions that they had back in the early 1980s about how D&D is run, and that requires a little bit more work on your end now, but I love running this adventure. I think it's fantastic. Against the Cult of the Reptile God is not a sandbox adventure. It is a quest. There's a town. The town's called Orlane, and that's one of the things that's cool about this adventure is it comes with a town. I think all good starting D&D adventures, you need a town and you want to know what's the name of the blacksmith, what's the name of the inn, is there a temple in town, what god is it dedicated to, what's the name of the local priest, is there a local wizard, is there somebody who can identify our magic items. I think that's one of the things we want when we're starting off our D&D campaign is we want a cool dungeon or a cool adventure, and we want a cool town to start in that is detailed enough to make it easy for us as dungeon masters to run. The way I use Against the Cult of the Reptile God is it doesn't really matter where the players start. Maybe they'll start on their way to Orlane. Maybe they'll start in a completely different nearby town, but they hear rumors of a curse on this town. And they'll meet people from Orlane who have left. They've packed up all their worldly belongings and they've evacuated the town. They've abandoned it because of the curse, because people they know have stopped acting normal, and people they grew up with stopped recognizing them. The people who've left Orlane feel like their town is cursed, and eventually it'll be all pod people, right? They don't know what's going on. They don't know why these people that they've known all their lives suddenly don't recognize them and act strangely. Now, in one game that I ran, the game at Turtle Rock Studios, one of the players, my friend Tom, his sister was from Orlane. So the adventure started with Tom getting a whole bunch of letters from his sister describing the events developing in Orlane. But that was just one plot hook for Tom. None of the other players had any hook into Orlane. And in fact, they didn't start that campaign in Orlane. They started in another town called the Village of Hommlet. This is another famous low-level adventure. It's considered by a lot of people one of the best low-level adventures. Again, it's super old school, and when I talk about old school, I mean like when you read it, every shop and farm has the people who live there detailed to a level that I'm not sure a new DM needs, and it includes stuff like where all their cash is. I think we talked about this in another video, where all their cash is, just in case the thief player wants to practice his pickpockets skill. I think somebody reading it now would think, why do I need to know where this farmer keeps his 27 copper pieces? Apart from that, though, the Village of Hamlet is a great low-level starting adventure because, again, like Against the Cult of the Reptile God, there's a great town here. It is very well detailed. There is a wizard who can identify magic items. There's a local druid. And there's a nearby dungeon, the Moat House, which is a great low-level dungeon, although there's not a clear reason why in Village of Hamlet you would ever go to that Moat House dungeon. Back in the day, Gary Gygax just assumed that if you were adventuring in this town and someone mentioned the nearby dungeon, the players would just want to go there. There's a dungeon nearby, let's go. But these days, I think players need a little bit more motivation to do stuff like that. One of the things I like doing is, if there's a half-orc character in the party, there are a couple of allies of the local evil cult that have kind of taken over the local general store. And so when the players show up, I enjoy having the two bad guys that run the general store mistake the half-orc player, or maybe the rogue or thief player, as a member of the cult. And suddenly this player is drawn into this conspiracy that they don't know anything about. So Village of Hamlet is one of the other adventures I use to seed my sandbox game. I drop all these adventures all over the place. I put them in nearby towns and villages. I put the dungeons nearby, and I let the players decide where they want to go. One of the interesting things about the Village of Hamlet is that it leads to, it doesn't include, but it leads to the Temple of Elemental Evil. The Temple of Elemental Evil is a kind of famous adventure, but it's also terrible. It is an awful, awful adventure. It is unreadable. It is probably unrunnable. I mean, you can run it. My friends have run it. But one of the things I noticed is everyone I know who ran it basically winged it. They read the adventure, they were confused, and they made stuff up based on what they thought the adventure was saying. There are resources online that if you search for, running the Temple of Elemental Evil, you'll find, I think Dragon's Foot, which is an old school, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons website. I think Dragon's Foot has a whole bunch of files you can download that help you parse and understand what's going on in Temple of Elemental Evil. And you need those things. Otherwise, you'll have no idea what's going on. So unfortunately, I can't really recommend the Temple of Elemental Evil, which Village of Hamlet is the beginning of, but Village of Hamlet is fine in and of itself. Like I said, it's a town and a nearby dungeon, just like Against the Cult of the Reptile God. Another low-level adventure that I drop into my sandbox setting is the Keep on the Borderlands. Really all I use, this is another classic starting adventure, really all I use from this is something called the Caves of Chaos. The Caves of Chaos are a great kind of low-level sort of open world like adventure thing. It's a valley basically with a whole bunch of cave openings in it, and it's up to the players to decide which cave openings to explore, and they all, or many of them, interconnect in the side of these hills. I think there's a necromancer in here somewhere, but apart from him, the Caves of Chaos are just a bunch of random monsters thrown together, and they skirmish with each other and fight with each other. It's one of the canonical examples of why are all these different monsters hanging out together without much rhyme or reason. But actually, if you read the adventure, they do talk about how different factions of monsters have alliances with each other, and these monsters don't like these monsters, and they skirmish all the time. I think a clever adventuring party could learn to negotiate with some of the monsters and make an alliance with some of them, and then use that alliance to exploit some other group of monsters in the caves. But again, it's just a bunch of random caves in the side of a hill. The first time my players ever encountered the notion of the bad guys grabbing an unconscious player character and dragging them off and then ransoming them back and saying, listen, we will return this unconscious hero to you if you give us 1,000 gold pieces and that magic sword you've got. The first time that ever happened was in the Caves of Chaos. I don't always use the Caves of Chaos in my sandbox game because unlike the other adventures, unlike Village of Hamlet, unlike Against the Cult of the Reptile God, there's no plot here. It's just usually what happens is the players are on their way from one place to another following some quest, and they get attacked by goblins. And if they follow the goblins back to their lair is in the Caves of Chaos. Along those same lines, one of the adventures I drop into my sandbox world is from this book, Dungeon Delve. It's a 4th edition book. It was fantastic. I have no idea why there isn't a 5th edition version of it. Dungeon Delve is just a whole bunch of little tiny adventures, often only 2 or 3 encounters, and there's one for every level. So there's a first level one and a second level one. They're fantastic. That's a great way if the players are on their way from point A to point B and you want to throw an adventure at them, or you need a random encounter, or the players want to play D&D tonight, you didn't have anything ready. Dungeon Delve is fantastic, but it is a 4th edition product, and I think 4th edition products are maybe the hardest to convert to 5th edition. There was something a little bit like this for 3rd edition called the Book of Challenges. So between the Book of Challenges and Dungeon Delve, both of which you can get on DM's Guild, I think there's lots of great, highly modular content that you can drop into your adventures. I don't know why there isn't a version of Dungeon Delve for 5th edition, except that Wizards of the Coast doesn't seem to believe believe in the notion of the modular adventure anymore. The idea of smaller chunks of content that's just for first level or first to third level. These days they put out, one book a year and it gets you from first level all the way to 10th level, and it's not modular at all. You can't just take one chunk of Storm King's Thunder and drop it into Out of the Abyss. So often my players in the sandbox game, when they get to whatever town they're going to, whether it's Orlane or Hommlet or some other town or Fairhill, which we'll talk about in a second, they see this broken tower over the tops of the trees and maybe they wonder what it is. And they get to town and they find out, well, it used to be a watchtower and it used to protect the town against bandits, but now we get attacked by bandits all the time because the tower is in ruin and it's been taken over by goblins. And it was a very successful first encounter, first adventure in my sandbox game. But the problem was, because it was near to the local town and because it seemed like a self-contained chunk of content, which it was, it's just a tower with a bunch of goblins, my players always went to this. So I stopped using it after a little while because I didn't want it. That's the opposite of an open world, right? If there's an obvious first thing to do, then I feel like I have failed to set up the open world sandbox well. I mean, obviously that means I'm kind of a lazy DM, right? Because if I wanted to, I could have put the broken tower somewhere else, made it a little bit farther away, made it maybe a little bit more dangerous, and therefore it wouldn't have seemed like such an obvious first thing to do. Or maybe let the players discover it sometime in the middle of some other adventure. But it is a great self-contained little objective. The players have to go solve the problem of the goblins in this tower, and there are some cool goblins in here. There are many different kinds of goblins in here. Makes it a lot of fun to run. Volo's Guide to Monsters now has lots of different kinds of some monsters, like lots of different kinds of goblins, for instance, and that would make something like this easier to run, or easier to convert, I guess I mean. As a chunk of content, it is bite-sized and it gives the players the sense of having accomplished something. They've taken the tower back from the goblins, and now the town will be able to put a watch garrison there and thereby protect the town against bandits. But again, I never tell the players that they have to do this or they should do this. I always make sure that the Broken Tower, the Caves of Chaos, the Village of Hamlet, the Village of Orlane from Against the Cult of the Reptile God, there are hooks to all of these things in front of the players, so it's up to them to decide what to do. In addition to Orlane and its nearby dungeon and Hamlet and its nearby dungeon, I also use the Village of Fairhill from the Crucible of Freya. This is a great low-level adventure. It also comes with a free downloadable prequel called the Wizards Amulet that you could use. They can either start in Fairhill or they can start in a nearby town, one of the nearby towns, and hear about the stolen crucible from the Temple of Freya. Or maybe it's not Freya, maybe one of your players is a priest to one god or saint, and instead of it being Freya in this town, it's that player's god. So even though they're not in Fairhill, when they hear this story about how a temple to their god had a magic item stolen from it, they're going to want to go there and get it back. That's an important point. If the players start in Orlane, they're going to want to solve the problem of the reptile god. If they start in Hamlet, they're going to want to solve the problem of the moat house. If they start in Fairhill, they're going to want to solve the problem of the missing crucible. So it's important that you make sure the players start somewhere where the nearest closest adventure isn't the most obvious. Like if you start in Hamlet, for instance, maybe the players have no hooks that lead them to the moat house. They've just heard about it, they wonder about it, but they do have hooks. You have given them hooks into the adventures in the other towns. So it's up to them to decide, where do we go? Sometimes I start the players at Tor Keep, which is the nearby local seat of the barony, and there's no adventure there. All there are rumors and hooks to all these other towns nearby, all of which are in trouble. That's sort of how the West Marches game works. And maybe the next video we'll talk about a West Marches style of game, because it is near and dear to my heart, but I've never done it. I think some people online are familiar with the West Marches as the name of someone's campaign, but before it was that, it was the name of a style of play that a guy named Ben Robbins came up with. Ben Robbins, who also came up with Microscope and Kingdom, which I bought and unfortunately I've never gotten to use, even though I really want to. I can do this kind of sandbox game because I've run each of these adventures. Each of these adventures was the beginning to some other campaign I ran years ago. So when I decided I wanted to do a sandbox game where I had no idea where the players were going to go, they had lots of options, I just grabbed all the low-level adventures that I had run that I thought were super cool. Finally, the last adventure that the players typically go on in my sandbox campaign, once they are around level 5, they tackle this, also happens to be one of the first adventure hooks they get, and that is the Keep on the Shadowfell. This was the first adventure published for 4th edition. It wasn't very good. Like, when you read it, the town that's described in it is terrible. It doesn't have anything like the detail that the other towns that I've described had. It was mostly like a World of Warcraft quest hub. So that part of it was really poor, but the dungeon in it isn't bad. I've used it many times. This is also where Caloril the Vile comes from. I'll have to put his name down here because people ask me questions about Caloril the Vile all the time, and it takes me a second to figure out what they're talking about because they don't spell it right. But how could you spell it right if all you've heard is me say it? I mean, that's not a person's normal name. That is one of the first things that happens in my sandbox game is the players meet Caloril the Vile, and he is building this fortress out of bodies. He's building the Black Tower, and the more corpses he gets, the bigger the tower gets. And that, by the way, is not from the adventure Keep on the Shadowfell. That's from the Black Company books by Glenn Cook, which I stole. I better move over now so you can see both of these. It's not from Keep on the Shadowfell, it's from the Black Company books. I do that all the time. I steal stuff from books all the time. So I made Keep on the Shadowfell a lot more interesting than what was in this original adventure. By meeting Caloril the Vile when the players are way too low level to do anything about him, it creates a great villain. The players have met the villain. Maybe they try to take him on. I have no problem with that. Maybe they try to go after him when they're not high enough level yet. I have no problem with that. The players should be allowed to get in over their heads. All of these adventures are all first or third level adventures. It's only Keep on the Shadowfell that is really out of the player's level range. And I love the idea of the players going after Caloril the Vile when they're not high enough level. One of the problems I've noticed my players have, and this is because they're not plugged into the traditions of D&D, is they want to wait until the last possible moment to go after some bad guy like Caloril the Vile, even though if they went after him, real honestly, if my players decided, listen, this guy is evil, we need to stop him, they probably could do it because they have to go through an entire dungeon to get to this dude, and they'd probably have a random encounter or two on the way there, so that they might not be 5th level when they get here, but they might be 3rd or 4th. I've noticed that players these days are not conscious of the fact that they haven't really put 2 and 2 together, and they don't realize we can decide to go after this guy now, and that's fine because we will get experience points and magic items as we go through the dungeon that he is the boss of. I also use my own homebrew stuff. I have the Tower of the Oracle, which is a thing I made up. I stole it from my friend Jim. I designed my own elven tower, and the players hear rumors about the orcs attacking it. It's an opportunity for them to go fight a bunch of orcs and also make some allies with local elves. You see how it works, right? Unfortunately, there's no trick to it. There's no easy way to do it. I have run a whole bunch of low-level adventures. I've picked the ones that I thought were fun to run and that I thought were cool for new players, and then I seed them all around the area, and I give the players different plot hooks. No one player has hooks for all of these things. In fact, the players often have competing hooks, and I want that feeling of the players arguing about what to do next. The players will often bargain. They'll say, okay, your sister's in trouble, so we'll go take care of that first, but then afterwards we have to go find my brother. That literally happened in one of my games. One of the phrases I use in my game is the clock is always ticking. It's a catchphrase. I eventually adapted it as the catchphrase to a local thieves guild, which I thought was fun. It's a phrase I deployed to tell the players, whichever these adventures you go on, whichever these problems you try to solve, the other bad guys at these other locations are advancing their plot. And as a result, if you save the town of Orlane, Lareth the Beautiful over in the Village of Hamlet may achieve his goals. I don't run the Village of Hamlet vanilla, by the way. This is some sort of advanced dungeon mastering. But what I do is I use the Moat House dungeon from Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil, which is a completely different product, but you can get it online. You can get it on the DM's Guild. And I think the Moat House dungeon in Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil is more fun and more interesting than the one in the vanilla Village of Hamlet. But that might be a reason for you to use the one in the original Village of Hamlet because it is a kind of straightforward low-level dungeon. Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil is a kind of follow-up adventure. It came out, I think, 15 or 20 years after the original Temple of Elemental Evil. It literally takes place 20 years after the events in the first adventure. So I just meld those two adventures, the town, the Village of Hamlet from the Village of Hamlet, and the Moat House dungeon from Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil, and my players have no idea I've done that. I want to give the players that feeling that their choices have consequences. So whichever adventure they pick up, the other adventures are ticking along, and those bad guys may achieve their goals. This ties into another style of play. I happen to like games where eventually armies clash and the players are worried about being able to muster enough units to defend the stuff they've built or taken. So that often ends up being the end of my sandbox game. I have my own rules for units and warfare, which I will eventually put up on the DM's Guild. They're not ready for prime time, much like my stronghold rules, which I am working on. For instance, if the players never go to the Caves of Chaos, the necromancer there summons an army of undead. A few units of undead, enough to take over the town that the players have been using as their base. If the players don't go to Orlane and deal with the cult of the reptile god, eventually a whole bunch of Yuan-Ti, that's a great reptilian bad guy, a whole bunch of Yuan-Ti, several units of Yuan-Ti show up at the local town to try to take it over. If the players never deal with Caloril the Vile, maybe he summons Lord Soth the Death Knight, and Lord Soth is leading the army of undead from the Caves of Chaos. See, it's up to you to decide what happens if the players don't deal with this stuff. Maybe each of these adventures is in stasis until the players go to try to solve these problems. But that creates another issue where where these are all low-level adventures, and eventually the players will have enough experience points that if you want to do it that way, you're going to have to take these other low-level adventures and buff them a little bit to make them challenging for the players. But I like selling the players on the reality of the world, the feeling that it's a living world, the feeling that whatever they do, all the other choices they have are all progressing. And regardless of what system you use, defending the town against an army of undead is epic. Defending the town against an army of UNT, defending the town against, at one point, the player summoned this huge, I think I used a Dragoloth, which is not a Godzilla-sized creature, but I made it Godzilla-sized for this purpose. That was an epic end to that campaign. And in each instance, the players knew this happened because we didn't take care of this problem. And it can be kind of frustrating for the players because they feel like, how could we have done everything? And to me, to my way of thinking, that kind of frustration is okay. The players shouldn't necessarily feel, in a sandbox game, maybe the players shouldn't feel like they can achieve every goal. That maybe they should feel like following one thread means letting another one lie fallow. Again, that's up to you. That's down to your taste. So what's next after the sandbox campaign? Do you keep playing this way? Normally what I do is I pick an adventure, and there are lots to choose from, that start at around 5th or 6th level, and we'll take a mega adventure that will take the players from 5th or 6th level up to 10th or 12th. Usually what I use is Red Hand of Doom, which is an awesome adventure. So all the while, as the players are going through the events in my low-level sandbox, they're also hearing about these hobgoblins from Red Hand of Doom. Or maybe I'll run an adventure in the Underdark. Maybe I'll segue to Night Below. Typically, after the players have gone through these 5 levels of sandbox game and defeated, or not, Caloril the Vile, I give them some downtime, and this is an opportunity for them to spend all their money and pursue their own interests. And usually that's the point where I do a lot of listening, and I try to pay attention to what the players are interested in doing, and then craft some content that allows them to follow that. Like, for instance, in my friend Brad's game, after we had gone through the first 5 or 6 levels of sandbox content, we were now free to do what we wanted, and I started building a stronghold. And when my friend Dave, who played a wizard, heard that I was building a stronghold, he decided that he wanted to do something like that, and he talked to Brad about it, and Brad opened up the map, and Dave literally looked at the map and pointed to a random hex and said, "Hey, who lives here?" And Brad says, "Oh, it's just a bunch of like barbarian tribes." And Dave says, "I am going to go down there and take that place over and build my wizard tower." And Brad was like, "Okay, fine." He came up with an adventure involving a whole bunch of barbarian tribes, and Dave had to fight with some and negotiate with others. And when he was done, he had some barbarian allies, and he built a tower, and he became the Baron of that area. That was purely self-directed. That was 100% up to Dave. So that's how I run a sandbox game. I have a bunch of adventures. I have Against the Cult of the Reptile God. I have the Village of Hommlet. I have the Broken Tower from Dungeon Delve. I have the Caves of Chaos, I have the Crucible of Freya, I have the Keep on the Shadowfell, and I seed some of these, rarely all of them. I choose and pick which ones to use depending on my players, and then I know typically that after that is going to be something like Red Hand of Doom, or Night Below, or my own custom content depending on what the players decide they want to do. I can get away with this because I've run a whole bunch of low-level adventures. You don't have to have done that to get your own sandbox game going. You only need a couple of choices, maybe only 2. And maybe they're not published adventures that have hours and hours of content that get you from 1st to 3rd level. Maybe it's just a couple of encounters. The principle is just that the players have different hooks, and not all players need a hook. First of all, one of the things I've noticed is not all players necessarily want an adventure hook because they often don't know what to do with it, right? So I give certain players, because I can usually tell which players are self-directed, I give them adventure hooks, and then they are the ones that are driving the adventure. So I only need 2 or 3 different threads for them to follow. Remember that in a given evening, 3 to 5 encounters is enough for the players to feel like they've gotten a lot done and they've accomplished something. So you only need to seed maybe 6 or 7 different encounters broken into 2 different threads for the players to feel like they have choice and they can go where they want and they can do what they want. The players will inevitably ask, but what about the adventure we didn't go on? Just remember to tell them the clock is always ticking. That's it for the Sandbox episode, folks. You'll probably have a lot of questions. Please ask them in the blah blah down below, or come by my subreddit /r/Matt Colville. Next episode, we might get back to politics. I do want to do a 4th edition video because a lot of people watched my interview with my friend Jim, and we talked about 4th edition, how much we both loved it, and that surprised a whole bunch of people. So to me, that warrants a video. I still want to talk about adventures. I still want to talk about campaign settings. As usual, there are no ads in front of my videos. I do not have a Patreon, but if you want to help support the channel, come by my Amazon page. There's a link in the doobly-doo down below. I am an independent fantasy author. I write fantasy novels as a hobby. Lots of people have bought them, and many of them like them. You might too. Look at the reviews, see what you think. Each book is $4, of which I see $3. So if you buy both books, you're throwing me $6. I do not recommend getting the book in print. I went to print because people bugged me and said I don't like reading on my Kindle. But unfortunately, the print version is really hard to update and keep up to date. So it's now, I think, 1 or 2 revisions stale. It's also way more expensive, and instead of seeing $3 from each book, I see $1 from each print book, so it's kind of a bad deal. But if you like things in print, go ahead and pick it up, knock yourself out. Who am I to tell you what to do? That was the Sandboxing episode, folks. I hope it was in some way useful or inspiring. Until next time, peace out.